Runners, the 80-20 rule might be a great concept, but in this video, I'm going to explain why it isn't for everyone. Welcome back to NLC Coach's Corner. My name is Lewis Moses, former international athlete turned coach and founder here at NLC. This week in NLC Coach's Corner, I wanted to talk all about the 80-20 rule. Firstly, what is it? What does it mean? So the 80-20 rule is a rule that says 80% of your training should be in that easy zone. So it should be down at that low zone, or people refer to as zone 1, zone 2 type training, nice and easy, all those easy runs, all those recovery runs. 20% of your training should be at the other end of the spectrum. That should be hard. So if we again, going back to our zonal model, let's take a 5-zone model, for example, 1 being the easiest, 5 being the hardest, then 20% of that work is going to come at the top end of that in zone 5, maybe zone 4 as well. But here's the thing. That general rule of thumb is pretty good if you're starting out as an athlete, and it can work in certain periods of your training cycle, but it won't work for everyone. And it certainly doesn't work at all times throughout the year. So let's unpick the reasons why this type of training method isn't for everybody. But first, I want to go into detail as to why it's become very popular. It's become popular on the internet because people are trying to get the attention of athletes and they want to create something whereby they feel everybody will buy into it. And this general rule of thumb, this general training rule, is a pretty good concept. It's quite solid. It's quite robust. Majority of the time, if you do 80% of your stuff easy and 20% of your stuff hard, you should be okay. But it doesn't mean it's the best type of training. It's suited to the general population. And that's what the people who are pushing this out there are trying to get to you. They're trying to get to you and say, right, this is right for everybody, but it's absolutely not. It's the same as the rule of, say, 10% increase in your mileage each week. Or people say, yeah, just increase your mileage 10% each week. It doesn't work like that. Yes, it's it's a good rule of thumb, but if you just kept increasing 10% each week, where do you end up? Plus, we all know that progress isn't just linear. And it's the same with this. If you just continue to do the same thing over and over and over again, then eventually you'll plateau with your training and you won't get the results that you deserve. Let's take a look at it in a little bit more detail. As I said, let's unpick this a little bit. So, for example, I'm going to use a marathon runner. A marathon runner goes through different phases of training depending on where they are in their training cycle. Now, where they are in that training cycle will depend on the type of training they are doing. And if they're in a big training block in the middle of that marathon training, then maybe 80% of their running easy might not be the best thing. Why not? Well, that's where we've got to know the demands of the event that we're training towards. And this is why I don't believe the 80-20 rule works for everybody. And it certainly doesn't work for all events across the board because all events are different. The demands of the 5K are very different to the training demands of a marathon. So how can that one concept, that one training concept, be the same for two different events and all different type of people? It just doesn't make sense. If you think about it like that logically, and a great coach once said to me, just think of things black and white. Just say it out loud to yourself. Does it make sense? And when you put it like that, you think, well, no, it can't be, because we've got all these different events and all these different types of people. So that one training rule cannot be right for everybody. So don't fall into the trap of thinking, I've seen it online, I've seen somebody put it out there, and that's definitely going to work for me. It may work for you. It might do at certain points in time, but don't just assume it will. So what other training models exist out there then? Well, there are a couple of other ones. We might say the 80-20 model is more of a polarized approach, whereby we've got a lot at one end and then a little bit at the other end. But there's other approaches to training as well. There's like a pyramidal approach whereby we put a lot of stuff in the middle. So if we go back to our training zones analogy, where we've got zone 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and I'm just using those zones for the purpose of this video. I know people use all different types of zones, but the pyramidal type approach would suggest that a lot more of our training is done in the middle. And this is a very kind of Scandinavian or Norwegian type model. It's become very famous with the Ingebrigtsen brothers in the track and field world because they do a lot of tempo and threshold work, which sits in the middle of those zones. So more in sorts of zones 3 and 4. And yes, there's still got sprinkles on the other side of that, but a lot of it predominantly is done in those middle sections. And again, is that right for everybody? No, absolutely not. But what we've seen is since the Ingebrigtsens have had success and since this model has become popular on social media, people have naturally started to follow it because this is what happens. But again, go back to my point. The same type of training cannot be right for everybody. It depends on the event that they're training towards. And I guarantee that at certain times of the year, that drastically changes. And for me, it comes down to periodization. And this is the most important thing here. The trap people fall into as athletes, runners of all abilities, is they just follow the same type of training week in, week out. Their Strava never changes. It's just like similar mileage or it's just slowly creeping up. And they follow that same pattern over a long period of time. They also fall into the trap of often racing too often and not really having target races and periodizing their plan towards those specific races. The most common time we see that done correctly is in a marathon builder, which is why I used the marathon runner earlier to give a quick example and why I want to go back to it now to elaborate on what I was talking about. So with the marathon runner, for example, in the early phases, we might do more of an 80-20 approach. You might take more of a polarized approach to training because we want a lot of easy aerobic running in there. And we want to build those foundations. We may want to sprinkle some faster work in there. But as we go through that plan and as we get to the specific block, as I mentioned before, we might want to go to more of a pyramidal approach. We might want more specific work, which would be more threshold type work and steady work. Why? Because we know that the marathon for most people falls within that type of range, that steady zone. It's more of a steady effort. If you're a marathon runner who's going to be planning on being out for 4, 5, 6 hours, then your marathon's going to be further down that scale. That's going to fall between steady and easy. So a lot more of your training might want to be down at that type of area in zone 2 and 3. And that's where you've got to understand yourself as an athlete, the amount of time you're going to be out on the road, and you've also got to understand the training demands of the event. And that is why it's a complicated sport. And that's why we exist as coaches, to try and figure all that out. And it is trial and error. It doesn't always work first time. But what I would say is if you don't trial it, then you won't know. But one method of training certainly isn't right for everybody. And that brings me nicely onto my final point. I always like to end these videos with final tips. So my starting point as an athlete, so I'm giving you my best coaching brain here and saying to you, where should you start when you're planning your training? Well, firstly, look at the demands of the event. And a good place to start is look at the time you're going to be out there. Because once you understand the time, you'll be able to understand the physiology a lot more. For example, if it's going to take you 1 hour to do a half marathon, we know that for 1 hour, that's roughly around sort of our tempo pace. So a lot more of your training might be focused around the tempo zone. If you're going to be training for something like 1 mile or, well, let's say with a mile, let's go middle distance. We don't often talk about that much, but I did mention Ingebrigtsens who compete over 1,500 a mile, 800 and even 3K and 5K. They are more middle distance events when we're talking specifically about the 1,500 meters and the mile. So you might want to focus more on anaerobic and some speed work and putting in some, maybe a little bit of tempo work, and a little bit of threshold work to make sure they're strong, because still predominantly an aerobic event, but you're going to have event specific work. That event for the Ingebrigtsens lasts around 3 minutes and 30 seconds. So they need to be working on that top end speed as well as that race specific speed. So again, it shows that model can't be right for everybody and you've got to be willing to vary it. Tip number 2 would be to make sure as you go through those phases of training, that training focus shifts slightly. So we have a nice intensity distribution in the training cycle. What I mean by that is you don't just have one type of training. You don't just go out and steady run, or you don't just go out and easy run. You vary your training. And within each block, that block has a different focus, because we now know by doing that, you can get nice changes, nice adaptations. And that is often where we get the biggest adaptations, when we focus on developing a specific training stimulus within a block. And again, if we just focus on the 80-20 throughout the entire period, then we aren't going to get the nice adaptations we want in all those different areas. My final tip is just don't go out and this is kind of contradictory, because I'm saying don't go out and listen to everyone on social media, then I'm putting out a video. But I'm trying to give educated advice here where I'm not selling anything. You know, I'm not selling you something where I say, go and buy my book that tells you to do this. No. Yes, you could buy into coaching if you wanted to. I'd love for people to do that when you levels coaching, but I'm not saying you have to. I'm putting out free content, and I'm doing it because I believe that people can be training better. So don't just go and look at influencers online who say, do this and come and buy my book, do this and come and buy my training plan. This is how you do it. This is the only way to do it. There's not always just one way to do it. There's lots of ways to do it. And that is why you should try it and don't be afraid to fail. It's not failing, it's learning from your mistakes as you go. And if you do learn, that's the only way you will grow. Hope you've enjoyed that episode. That was all about the 80-20 rule and why it isn't right for every single runner. Hopefully you are enjoying your training. You are finding the right training for you. As always, if you have enjoyed these videos, go and check some of the other ones out. Be sure to like it and subscribe to our channel. So hit that subscribe button if you are enjoying the content. We've got lots more good content to put out. And don't forget to check out our New Levels Coaching podcast, as well as our New Levels Coaching website, which also has lots of blogs and articles on there. As always, continue to enjoy your training. Best of luck with anybody who's racing, and we'll see you all again very, very soon.